What if the happiest place in a movie about Depp is actually the afterlife? That sounds like a joke, especially when the movie begins with a wedding rehearsal that feels almost completely lifeless. Victor van Dort stands in a stiff Victorian room surrounded by people who expect him to perform a role he does not understand. His parents want a successful marriage. Victoria verglots parents want haar familie social status restored. De priest wants de ceremonie rehearsed correctly. Everyone has a plan for Victor and Victoria, and almost nobody seems interested in asking either of them what they actually want. Then Victor walks into a forest to practice his wedding vows. He is nervous. His stemless over the words. He cannot remember the proportions. And when he finally manages to say the vows correctly, he places a wedding ring onto what appears to be a dead branch sticking out of the ground. Except it isn't a branch. It is Emily's finger. The ground moves. A sorceresses from the earth. And before Victor can process what is happening, Emily looks at him as though he has just fulfilled the promises he has been waiting years to hear. To Victor, this is a nightmare. To Emily, it is a miracle. That contradiction is the heart of corpsebrede. Bechouse the obvious interpretation is that Emily is the probleem. Victor is a liefde. Victoria is a liefde. Emily is Depp. Therefore, sie relate Depp wo man mist bitte obstacle standing between the living couple and their happy ending. But the movie slowly asks us to question that assumption. What if Emily is not the villain? What if the real problem is the world that existed before she ever appeared? Look closely at the two societies the film creates. The land of the living is dominated by grey walls, narrow rooms, stiff clothing, anxious parents, social hierarchy, financial pressure, and conversations where everyone is carefully measuring what another person is worth. It is technically the world of the living, and almost everything about it feels frozen. Then Victor enters the land of the dead. Suddenly, the colors become brighter. The spaces become larger. Music erupts from every corner. Skeletons dance. People laugh. Nobody seems particularly concerned with maintaining the perfect appearance of respectability. The dead are chaotic, ridiculous, theatrical, and somewhat misgrote, but they are also strongly honest. The movie creates an extraordinary visual irony. The living world looks dead. The dead world looks alive. And Emily exists directly between two ideas. She is a corpse, but she is also the character who carries the most obvious emotional wound. She was onze young woman who believed she was going to marry the man she loved. Instead, that man betrayed her, murdered her, and left her body hidden in the forest. Her tragedy is not simply that she did. It is that someone else made the decision about her life for her. That detail changes everything. Emily is not merely looking for a husband. She is looking for the future she was denied. Victor never intended to marry her, but that does not make her feelings meaningless. From Emily's perspective, the moment in the forest appears to be the first time someone has chosen her. The wedding ring is not just a piece of jewelry. Het is proof dat sommige finale made a promise. Of kjause Victor has not treleit choosing her. Hij has panieket. Hij has made a mistake. Ante is stil in loofe witte Victoria. Sote central conflict is not really a competition between two women fighting over one man. It is a collision between three people whose choices have been controlled by forces outside themselves. Victor cannot decide whether once Mariage bechoose his entire life has taught him to obey. Victoria cannot openly choose Victor bechouse her family has redated Mariage to a financial transaction. And Emily has spent her entire existence paying the price for another person's greed. That is why the final uit matters so much. Bechouse when Emily finally understands the truth, the movie killed half given her the conventional ending. Ze killed half deviated Victoria. Ze killed half forced Victor to remain with her. Ze killed half bekome te yellow supernatural brede audiences expected. Instead, ze do something much harder. Ze lets him go. And suddenly the strange story about a that brede bekome something much more human. Emily finally realizes wat ze was te niet in leven. Not a husband. Not revenge. Not even a conventional happily ever after. Ze realizes freedom. Dat is why korpse brede is more emotionally complicated than its premises suggests. It begins by asking what happens when a man accidentally marries a dead woman. It ends by asking something much more difficult. Kan ou trelei love sommige if ou refuse to let them choose? Section 1.2 Video roadmap. To understand why corpse brede still works, we have to move beyond the basic plot and examine the machinery underneath it. Bechouse on the surface, this is a fairy tale about Victor accidentally marrying Emily, trying to return to Victoria, and eventually discovering that his supernatural marriage has consequences. But underneath that story is a thoroughly constructed examination of anxiety, social pressure, class insecurity, loneliness, mortality, and the complicated difference between wanting sommige and loving sommige. Victor is especially interesting because his biggest weakness is not that he is cowardly. It is that he struggles to make decisions. Almost everyone around him has already decided what his future sal look like. His parents decide hoe hy sal marry. Victoria's family decides wat sy sal beword. The priest decides wat a proper wedding sal look like. Emily believes the accidental force have created a permanent bond. Victor spends much of the movie reacting. His journey is therefore less about becoming brave in the traditional heroic sense and more about becoming responsible for his own choices. Emily's journey is even more complicated. Sy begins as sommige wo has already been niet agen sy. Her life was stolen from her, her trust was exploited, and her death became a secret. When Victor arrives, sy believes Vater has finally given her another chance. But the movie refuses to turn that desire into entitlement. Emily eventually has to confront the painful truth that wanting sommige does not give out the right to keep them. Victoria, meanwhile, is one of the film's tragedies. She is alive, intelligent, and capable of understanding Victor uit her own family treats her future as a bargaining chip. Sy is not impressionate behind literal bars foremost of the story, but the emotional architecture around her functions almost like a prison. Ten tiere is Lord Barkis. At first, he appears to be the police adult who can solve the everglots financial problems. But eventually, his charm reveals itself as a weapon. He sees marriage as an investment. He sees vulnerable women as opportunities. In that sense, he is not simply a villain who happens to exist in the story. He represents the extreme version of the social logic already surrounding Victor and Victoria. The film's visual design reinforces all of this. The land of the living is largely monochromatic, formal, cramped, and controlled. The land of the dead is vibrant, spacious, musical, and expressive. That contrast is not simply an aesthetic choice. It is a psychological map. The movie also uses misses to reveal emotions that its characters struggle to express directly. Songs compress backstory, expose insecurity, establish social expectations, and turn grief into performance. Stop motion itself becomes part of the storytelling because every movement feels physical and deliberate. The puppets are not simply animated objects. Their stiff limbs, expressive faces, strange proportions, and handmade textures create a world that feels simultaneously artificial and intimate. And ten tiere is the question of why this movie feels so different when I watch it as an adult. As children, we may remember the bleak corpsebrede, the skeletons, the songs, the jokes, the creepy wedding, and the butterflies. As adults, we start noticing the parents. The financial desperation. The manipulation. The fear of disappointing everyone. The fact that several characters are being pushed toward meer lieve decisions before they have a real freedom to make them. Dat is weer een kortse brede bekomes in het pekterlei personaal. Bechause growing older often means realizing that the pressure Victor feels is not as fantastical as it ons seemt. The wedding my begotis. The expectations are not. Section 1.3 Audience fonestion. Tiere is a strange experience that happens when you revisit a movie you loved as a child and realize the movie was never really speaking only to children. Korpsebrede is one of those films. When you are hang, the immediate attraction is obvious. The character designs are unforgettable. Emily's bleeskin, skeletal friends, overzet crooked buildings, musical numbers, and bizarrely cheerful afterlife create an aesthetic that feels completely unlike ordinary animation. The movie is creepy without being terrifying, sad without becoming hopeless, and funny without destroying its darker atmosphere. But then you watch it years later. And suddenly Victor makes more sense. His nervousness no longer looks like a simple comedic trait. It looks like a physical expression of someone who is terrified of disappointing everyone around him. His awkwardness becomes familiar. His inability to remember the facts becomes recognizable as the anxiety of someone who knows that ohne mistake killed change his entire future. And the adults around him become much less amusing. Victor's parents are not simply silly social climbers. They are insecure people who have spent their lives trying to move upward. Victoria's parents are not simply snobbish aristocrats. Ty are desperate people clinging to a social identity that is already collapsing. Mariage bekomes a transaction. Children bekome extensions of family status. Lofe bekome secondary to appearances. When oure anger, dat my seem absurd. When oure older, it kan feel incomfortably recognizable. Victoria bekome more interesting toe. As a schild, it is easy to see her as the girl Victor Lofes. As an adult, it becomes easier to notice of little control ze has over her own vertiere. Her parents have already decided wat Maria gemeens voor haar. She is expected to accept a stranger if that stranger can receive the family financially. Antentere is Emily. Her story is probably te one dat changes te most witte age. A schuld mag het see Emily as the school blee korpse wo comes out of the ground. An adult sees a woman who trusted someone and paid for that trust with her life. Her achievement when Victor accidentally marries her becomes heartbreaking once we understand why it matters so much. She is not simply cheated because she has found a husband. She is cheated because someone has finally gevonden her the promise that was taken away. Dat maakt the ending hurt more. Because Emily's victory is not getting Victor. It is realizing that she does not need to possess him to prove that her love was real. There are also details that become darker with the every rewatch. The joke is about Depp. The casual way the Depp talk about their former lives. The contrast between the parents' concern about money and Emily's complete lack of material expectations. The white wedding ceremony become simultaneously romantic and disturbing. The fact that the film gaan make a corpse's heartbreak veel more sincere than the living characters' conversations about marriage. This is why nostalgia alone cannot uitplein corpse bredes longeviteit. Nostalgia my bring people back. Bitte films themes gevite Maria son to stay. And before we can fully understand why those themes work. We need to understand of the filmmakers manage to turn such an initial premise into a bicycle world that feels almost tangible. Because corpse brede did not emerge from nowhere. It came from a very specific artistic tradition, a specific period in animation, and a production process that was almost as initial as the story itself. Part 2, Content Background. Section 2.1, Production Origins. The idea behind corpse brede reaches back much further than the Fineset 2005 film. At its foundation is a traditional Jewish folktale about a man who accidentally places a wedding ring on the finger of a corpse buried in the ground. The basic premise already contains the strong mystery that will eventually define the movie, romance, theater, accidental commitment, superstition, and dark humor. But adapting a folktale into a modern animated feature requires more than preserving the premise. The filmmakers needed characters audiences felt emotionally understand. They needed a world that could support comedy without destroying the tragedy. And most importantly, they needed to decide what kind of story the corpse bride herself would represent. Dat is weer Tim Burton's artistische sensibiliteit bekomes important. Burton had spent much of his career returning to outsiders, misfits, lonely figures, strange characters, and people whose appearance causes society to misunderstand them. His worlds often place initial individuals inside the systems that reward conformity. His characters are frequently distributed as vruchtiening before audiences te stover dat die real probleem is isolation. Dat maak is Emily almost perfectly cited to his creatieve universe. Sy looks like a horror. But she is not a horror. Her appearance tells us she is dead. Her behavior tells us she is lonely. Her bicycle designated for has to perform two contradictory jobs at once. Sy must look like a corpse while still being beautiful en nou dat audiences understand why Victor and Fevers gaan bekome emotionally attached to her. Desolation is one of the film's greatest visual achievements. Emily is elegant and decorated at the same time. Her blue skin geves her an otherworldly appearance, but it also makes her visually distinct from the grey living world. Her enormous is communicate vulnerability. Her skeletal proportions remind is dat sy is basically dead, uit her movements remain expressive and graceful. Victor is designated differently. He is thin, awkward, pale, and almost basically folded into himself. His body langgerige communicates and sit before his size aanuiting. His long limbs and nervous movements make him look like a someone who has never been comfortable occupying space. Victoria, by comparison, is elegant and delicate. Her design reflects the social world she comes from. She looks refined, controlled, and almost porcelain-like. Betere is sadness beneath that elegance bechouse her visual perfection is part of the system that limits her. Tente filmmakers created the two worlds. The land of the living is narrow, meted, and formal. Architecture seems to close around the characters. Rooms are filled with stringent lines, rigid furniture, and controlled compositions. The land of the dead is almost the opposite. It opens outward. It becomes colorful. It becomes musical. Characters move with exaggerated energy. The dead are not hidden away in silence. They have created autonomy. This was crucial because the filmmakers did not want the afterlife to become a conventional horror setting. If the dead world were simply vruchtiening, Emily wilt automatically become the monster and the story wilt become much simpler. Instead, the dead world becomes inviting. That decision transforms the movie's moral geography. The vruchtiening plaatse is not necessarily the plaatse with the corpses. The vruchtiening plaatse is the plaatse where people have no freedom. Stop motion was equally important. Rather than creating these characters entirely through computer animation, the production relied on passive puppets and miniature environments that could be photographed ohne frame at a time. That process is extraordinarily slow and demanding. Every movement has to be carefully adjusted. A character taking a single step may require numerous individual poses. A facial expression may involve replacement pieces or carefully articulated mechanisms. That basically contributes directly to the film's atmosphere. How can feel that these characters exist as objects in space? Their clothing has texture. Their environments have surfaces. Their shadows behave like a part of the world. Effente imperfections of stop-motion gaan create emotioneel warmte bechouse theoremend is dat every movement was basically constructed. The puppets themselves is weer miniature performers. The sets weer miniature stages. The cameras weer documenting tenai bicycle worlds. Ante filmmakers had to make toese tenai worlds veel enormous. Dat chalinge etplains wij production desigen is so important here. De forest cannot simply be a background. De grafwerk cannot simply be a location. De diet kitay cannot simply be a colorful sense. Every environment reinforces the emotional state of the characters. De forest represents transition. De grafe represents buried history. The living houses represent social confinement. The land of the dead represents a strange kind of liberation. Effente decomposition of Emily's body becomes part of the visual storytelling. Her missing vlese het posit bonus en dan mag het apparanse kult have made hertes gesting. Instead, te desig maak is haar sympathetis. Dat balanse is extremely difficult. The film has to begroetes gee en nouge to remain a godheid vir tale bit beautiful en nouge to support a romance. Antat is one of the central artistic ideas behind Corpse Bride. Diat is not made beautiful by pretending it is not diat. Diat is made beautiful by giving it personality. Section 2.2 Prereliase landskape. When Corpse Bride arriveert in 2005. Animation was already moving rapidly toward a digital future. Computer-generated animation had become a dominant force in mainstream theatrical releases. Audiences were becoming accustomed to in creating detailed digital characters, elaborate environments, flight camera movements, and visual effects that would have been almost impossible to create only a decade earlier. Stop motion by comparison felt almost stubbornly bicycle. It was slower, more labor-intensive, less commercially predictable. Unbechouse every frame had to be created through bicycle manipulation. It carried a visual texture that digital animation felt imitate but not perfectly reproduce. Dat made Corpse Bride initial before audiences even kneef de story. Ten charme te Tim Burton name. For many fevers Burton's involvement immediately created expectations. Publiek kneef de visual langhage, gotisch architecture, elongated figures, pale faces, strange outsiders, macabre comedy, melancholy romance. And almost immediately, another comparison became unavoidable. Tenig het maar before Christmas. Both films were stop-motion musicals associated with the Tim Burton's godheid aesthetics. Both is it exaggerated character decisions. Both treated theater and darkness as sources of comedy. Both combined theatrical misses with the fairy-tale storytelling.
So audiences naturally expected Corpse Bride to become another version of that experience. But the two films are not identical. The Nightmare Before Christmas is fundamentally a story about identity, obsession, and the danger of wanting to become something you are not. Corpse Bride is much more focused on relationships, social obligation, loneliness, and the meaning of release. That distinction matters because it explains both the film's appeal and some of the criticism surrounding it. Marketing had to communicate several things at once. This was a family-friendly animated movie, It was also a gothic fantasy. It had romance. It had death. It had comedy. It had musical numbers. And it featured major stars, including Johnny Depp and Helena Bonham Carter. That combination was unusual. For adults, the Burton aesthetic created immediate recognition. For younger audiences, the skeletons and songs created entertainment value. For animation enthusiasts, the stop-motion craftsmanship became part of the attraction. But there was also a commercial question hanging over the project. Could a stop-motion film compete in an era increasingly dominated by CGI? The answer was not guaranteed. Stop-motion had already proven that it could attract mainstream audiences, but every new production required enormous patience and specialized craftsmanship. It was not simply a cheaper alternative to computer animation. In fact, the physical process could be more restrictive. If a set was damaged, it had to be repaired physically. If a puppet broke, it had to be fixed. If an animator made a mistake, the work might have to be repeated. That made the film's eventual theatrical presence feel significant. It was not trying to imitate digital animation. It was presenting handcrafted animation as a cinematic identity. And that distinction would become increasingly important as the audience entered the story. Because once the opening begins, all those production choices become invisible. We stop thinking about the puppets. We stop thinking about the miniature sets. We simply meet Victor. And suddenly the story starts. Part 3 Story Recap. Section 3.1. Act 1 Setup. The film opens in a world where everything appears carefully arranged. Victor Van Dort is preparing to marry Victoria Everglot, but neither family is approaching the wedding primarily as a celebration of love. For Victor's parents, the marriage represents social advancement. The Van Dorts have money, but they lack the aristocratic status of the Everglots. They see Victoria's family as a doorway into a higher social class. For the Everglots, the situation is almost the reverse. Their aristocratic identity remains, but their money is disappearing. Their house looks grand because it is supposed to look grand. Their clothing is elegant because it has to communicate status. Their social position is collapsing beneath the surface. Victoria therefore becomes the solution to a financial problem, and Victor becomes the solution to a class problem. It is not exactly the romantic foundation most fairy tales begin with. Then Victor and Victoria meet, and something unexpected happens. They actually like each other. Their relationship is awkward because both are nervous, but the awkwardness creates a sense of authenticity. Neither is presented as a perfect romantic hero. Victor struggles to speak. Victoria is cautious. Yet they recognize something in each other. They are both outsiders inside their own families. That makes their connection meaningful. Unfortunately, their wedding rehearsal goes badly. Victor cannot remember the vows. He becomes overwhelmed by the pressure. The priest grows frustrated. Everyone expects Victor to perform the ceremony correctly, and the more pressure he receives, the worse he becomes. Eventually, he is sent away to practice the vows alone. So Victor enters the forest. This is the first major transition in the story. The living world has been full of rules. The forest exists outside those rules. It is dark, quiet, and mysterious. Victor begins practicing his vows, repeating the words until they finally come naturally. He places the ring on what he believes is a branch. The ring catches. A finger rises from the earth. Emily emerges. And Victor realizes that the words he has been practicing may have created something much more serious than he intended. Emily believes they are married. Victor believes he has just made a terrible mistake. That difference in interpretation becomes the engine of the entire movie. Emily is overjoyed. Victor is horrified. And the audience is placed in the strange position of understanding both of them. From Victor's perspective, a corpse has appeared from the ground and claimed him as her husband. From Emily's perspective, a young man has finally spoken the vows she has been waiting to hear. Neither perspective is completely false. That is what makes the situation emotionally complicated. Victor has not intentionally chosen Emily, but Emily has no reason to understand that immediately. She has already experienced a world in which promises mean very little. Now someone has made one to her. The accidental wedding therefore becomes more than a supernatural joke. It becomes a collision between intention and interpretation. Victor did not mean to marry Emily. Emily believes he did. And suddenly the boundary between life and death becomes a boundary between two incompatible ideas of commitment. Section 3.2. Act 1 Continued Call to Adventure. Victor is soon taken into the land of the dead, and the experience is almost the exact opposite of what he expected. He expects horror. Instead, he finds community. The dead are everywhere. And they are not particularly interested in behaving like monsters. They joke. They sing. They argue. They celebrate. They recognize Victor as something extraordinary because he is alive. The land of the dead becomes a place where death has not erased personality. In some ways it has removed the pressure to pretend. The dead no longer need to impress society. They no longer need to maintain wealth. They no longer need to protect reputations. They simply exist. Emily introduces Victor to this strange new world with excitement, because she believes her accidental marriage has solved the loneliness that has followed her into death. Victor, however, is still thinking about Victoria. His first instinct is escape. He wants to return to the living world and fix the mistake. That desire is understandable. But the longer he spends with Emily, the more difficult it becomes to treat her as a supernatural problem. She is a person. A wounded person, a lonely person who has been waiting, and that creates Victor's first real moral conflict. If he simply runs away, he may hurt Emily. If he stays, he may betray Victoria. If he tells Emily the truth, he risks destroying the happiness she has just discovered. The land of the dead also changes Victor's perception of mortality. The dead are not silent. They are expressive. They are not ashamed of their bodies. They do not seem particularly interested in the social hierarchy that dominates the living world. The contrast becomes almost absurd. The living are obsessed with maintaining appearances. The dead have nothing left to prove. Victor eventually finds a way back to the living world. And his reunion with Victoria briefly restores hope. They still want to be together. That matters because the film does not pretend Victor's feelings for Victoria disappear simply because Emily is sympathetic. The triangle is not built around changing romantic preferences. It is built around conflicting obligations. Victor loves Victoria. He cares about Emily. And he is trapped by a promise he never intended to make. Then Lord Burkiss appears. At first, he looks like the kind of man the Everglots desperately need. He is confident, charming, polished, socially capable. But his confidence has a different quality from Victor's nervousness. Victor is afraid of using people because he is afraid of making the wrong decision. Burkiss uses people because he has no moral hesitation about doing so. His charm is not warmth. It is camouflage. As the pressure surrounding Victoria's future increases, Burkiss positions himself as an alternative. The families begin looking for solutions. Victor is pulled back toward Emily, and the story starts revealing that the accidental marriage is not the only relationship in which someone is being denied the freedom to choose. Section 3.3. Act 2: A Rising Action. As the story continues, Victor's relationship with Emily changes. First, he sees her as a problem. Then he begins seeing her as a person. That transition is one of the quietest but most important developments in the movie. Emily is excited about preparing for marriage because she has already imagined what marriage should have been. She wants celebration, connection, and the feeling of finally belonging to someone. Victor, however, is uncomfortable with the situation because he knows that Emily's happiness is based on a misunderstanding. He is not cruel enough to exploit her feelings, but he is not decisive enough to solve the problem immediately. That hesitation creates emotional tension. Victoria, meanwhile, is being pushed further into a situation she never chose. Her parents' financial desperation becomes more explicit. They are not thinking about whether Victoria is emotionally prepared. They are thinking about survival. Marriage is treated as an economic mechanism. This is where the film's class satire becomes increasingly obvious. The Van Dorts want access to aristocratic status. The Everglotts want financial security. Burkiss wants wealth. Emily wants love. Victor wants freedom from pressure. Victoria wants the ability to choose the person she actually cares about. These desires overlap, but they are not the same. Emily's past becomes increasingly important. She was once a young woman preparing to marry a man she trusted. That man promised her a future. Then he betrayed her. The details of her death transform the wedding dress into a symbol of interrupted life. It represents the future that was supposed to happen but never did. That is why Emily is so attached to marriage. She is not obsessed with ceremony for its own sake. She is grieving an unfinished life. Victor gradually understands this. The dead characters provide comic relief throughout these increasingly serious developments. Their jokes are not just there to entertain children. They keep the story from collapsing under the weight of its own tragedy. That balance is essential. Death in Corpse Bride is absurd. Life is absurd too. The difference is that the dead have learned how to laugh about it. Emily becomes more vulnerable as Victor's conflict becomes more obvious. She senses that something is wrong. Victoria is pressured by her family. Burkiss begins looking increasingly attractive to people who value social solutions over emotional truth. And Victor becomes trapped between two worlds. He cannot simply choose Victoria without hurting Emily. He cannot remain with Emily without betraying Victoria. And he cannot continue avoiding the decision forever. The story is moving toward a wedding. But the deeper question is becoming clear. Which wedding represents genuine love? The ceremony arranged by society? The accidental vows made in the forest? Or the decision that someone freely makes when there is nothing left to gain? Section 3.4. Act 2B: Midpoint Crisis. The closer Victor gets to understanding Emily, the more painful the situation becomes. He learns that Emily's tragedy was not simply an accident. She trusted a man who saw marriage as an opportunity. Her fiancé promised her love. Instead, he wanted what he believed she could give him: money, security, status. When he realized that the marriage would not provide what he expected, he betrayed her. That history makes Lord Burkiss's presence even more disturbing. Because Berkis is not simply another arrogant man. He is connected to the same pattern of exploitation. He sees marriage as leverage. He sees wealthy women as opportunities. He evaluates people according to what they can provide. The contrast with Victor becomes increasingly important. Victor enters marriage because other people push him toward it. Berkis enters marriage because he wants to exploit it. Emily wants marriage because she believes in emotional commitment. Victoria wants marriage only if it allows her to choose the person she loves. The same institution means something completely different to each character. That is why the film's supernatural rules begin to feel serious. The dead world may be chaotic, but it still has consequences. A vow matters. Promise matters. A marriage matters. The fact that the wedding began accidentally does not erase its emotional consequences. Victor starts considering whether he should accept the marriage to Emily. Not because he suddenly stops caring about Victoria, but because he realizes that Emily's feelings are real. This is the point where the film could have become a conventional romantic triangle. Instead, it becomes a story about responsibility. Victor understands that there is no perfect solution in which nobody gets hurt. Every choice has a cost. Emily eventually recognizes the conflict too. She sees that Victor's heart belongs somewhere else. And that realization is devastating. Because Emily has spent the entire story believing that the wedding ring means she has finally been chosen. Now she understands that the ring may only represent a mistake. That is the emotional midpoint. The question is no longer whether Victor can escape. It is whether Emily can accept that being loved does not necessarily mean being chosen as someone's partner. That distinction will eventually define her entire character arc. And while Victor and Emily struggle with that emotional truth, Berkis moves closer to revealing what he actually wants. The apparent romantic conflict begins transforming into something darker. The film is no longer asking which man Victoria should marry. It is asking whether any person should be treated as a prize at all. Section 3.5. Act 3 Climax Resolution. The final act brings the worlds together. Victor is prepared to face the consequences of his supernatural marriage. Emily has finally understood that his love for Victoria is genuine. Berkis's mask begins to fall away. The man who presented himself as charming and sophisticated reveals what he has always been. A predator. His confidence was never evidence of moral strength. It was evidence that he believed he could take what he wanted. The revelation also connects him directly to Emily's tragedy. The woman who was once betrayed finally stands face to face with the man responsible for destroying her future. The confrontation is satisfying because Emily is no longer merely remembering what happened to her. She is present. She can see the truth. And the dead are there with her. Berkis is exposed, and the consequences finally reach him. His defeat is not simply the removal of a villain. It is the destruction of the idea that people can be treated as possessions without consequences. But even after Berkis is defeated, Victor and Emily still have to confront the real problem. They are still bound by a marriage that began through accident. Victor is still connected to Victoria. Emily has to decide what she will do with the truth she has discovered. And this is where her character becomes extraordinary. She could insist on keeping Victor. She could argue that he belongs to her because he made the vows. She could demand that the supernatural rules be followed literally. Instead, she releases him. Emily understands that Victor loves Victoria. She understands that forcing him to stay would recreate the same kind of imprisonment she experienced in life. She removes the ring, and the symbolic meaning is enormous. The ring represented a promise. It also represented possession. By letting it go, Emily separates love from ownership. She finally chooses freely. Then her body begins to transform. The corpse that once seemed trapped becomes something weightless. Butterflies rise from her remains, and the imagery changes the meaning of death itself. Emily does not simply disappear. She transforms. The girl who spent her life in death trapped by someone else's decisions finally becomes free. The butterflies represent movement, change, release, a future that does not require possession. Victor and Victoria can now be together. But the film does not make that victory triumphant in a simple way, because someone has been lost. And yet Emily has also gained something: peace. Her ending is bittersweet, because she does not receive the conventional romantic reward. She receives something more important to the story: agency. That is why the final sequence redefines everything that came before it. Emily was never simply trying to steal Victor. She was trying to recover the choice that had been taken from her. And once she realizes that genuine love cannot exist without freedom, she becomes the character with the greatest agency in the entire film. The dead woman becomes the one who understands life most clearly. Part 4. Character Analysis. Section 4.1. Protagonist Deep Dive. Victor Van Dort is easy to underestimate. First, he seems like a standard nervous protagonist. He stammers. He panics. He apologizes constantly. His body folds inward whenever someone puts pressure on him. He looks like someone who would rather disappear than make a decision. But that nervousness is not simply a personality quirk. It is the central psychological problem of his character. Victor has spent his life being told what to do. His parents tell him whom he should marry. The wedding rehearsal tells him how he should behave. The priest tells him how to perform the ceremony. Emily believes his accidental vows have already determined his future. Victoria's family determines the circumstances surrounding her. Even when Victor returns to the living world, he discovers that other people are still making decisions around him. His problem is not that he has no desires. He clearly wants Victoria. His problem is that he has difficulty acting on those desires when action might disappoint someone else. That makes his anxiety much more relatable. Many people are not afraid of decisions because they do not know what they want. They are afraid because they know that choosing one thing means rejecting another. Victor's entire story is built around that fear. When he first encounters Emily, his instinct is to treat her as an obstacle. That makes sense from his perspective. But emotionally, it is incomplete. He sees the situation through his own fear. Only gradually does he begin seeing Emily's pain. That shift is his real development. He learns empathy. He learns responsibility. He learns that his actions have consequences even when his intentions were innocent. That distinction matters because Victor never intentionally hurts Emily. But good intentions do not erase consequences. The film therefore pushes him toward a more mature understanding of responsibility. He cannot simply say, "I didn't mean it." He has to ask, "What do I do now?" That is a much harder question. Victor's relationship with death also becomes part of his adulthood. The land of the dead forces him into a world he cannot control. Instead of escaping immediately, he begins learning from the people there. He discovers that Emily's pain is real. He discovers that death does not automatically erase emotional attachment. And eventually, he becomes willing to sacrifice himself. That is the irony of his arc. At the beginning, Victor cannot even deliver a wedding vow correctly. By the end, he is willing to accept the ultimate consequence of one. He begins as someone who fears irreversible decisions. He ends as someone willing to make one. That is why his heroism is subtle. Victor does not become physically stronger. He does not defeat Berkis through superior combat ability. He does not suddenly become charismatic. He becomes morally responsible. His greatest transformation is internal. He stops waiting for someone else to decide his future. And that is precisely what makes Emily's final choice possible. Section 4.2. Antagonist Psychology. Lord Berkis is one of the most interesting characters in the film because he represents the social system that surrounds everyone else. He is charming, confident, elegant. He knows how to perform respectability, and that is exactly why he is dangerous. Berkis understands that society rewards appearances. He knows how to say the right things. He knows how to present himself as a gentleman. But underneath the performance is a simple motivation. He wants wealth. He wants access. He wants control. His relationships are transactions. That makes him the thematic opposite of Emily. Emily believes a wedding represents emotional commitment. Berkis sees it as an economic opportunity. The contrast with Victor is equally important. Victor is also pushed into marriage, but he does not want to exploit anyone. His problem is passivity. Berkis's problem is predatory intention. Victor fears making choices because he might hurt someone. Berkis makes choices specifically because he believes other people's suffering is irrelevant. That difference makes Berkis a useful mirror. He represents what the social world looks like when its transactional logic is taken to its extreme. The Everglots already view marriage as financial survival. The Van Dorts view marriage as social advancement. Berkis simply removes the polite language and turns the same logic into outright exploitation. He evaluates people according to value. That is why his confidence initially works. He appears successful because the society around him rewards the qualities he possesses. But eventually the performance collapses. The truth becomes visible. And his death carries symbolic meaning. The villain belongs to the living world. The corpse bride does not destroy the living because she is dead. The living man destroys lives because he treats other people as objects. That is one of the movie's most important reversals. Death does not make Emily monstrous. Life does not make Berkis good. Morality exists somewhere deeper than either category. Section 4.3. Supporting Cast Dynamics. Victoria Everglot is quieter than Victor and Emily, but that does not mean she is unimportant. She represents something the other characters experience differently. The possibility of chosen love inside a system that does not allow much choice. Victoria understands Victor. She sees his awkwardness. She recognizes his kindness. And she does not demand perfection from him. That makes their relationship feel genuine. But Victoria's family treats her differently. Her parents see her primarily as a solution to their financial problems. Their aristocratic identity has become a burden, but they still refuse to abandon it. That contradiction creates much of the film's comedy. They are trying to preserve an image of wealth while desperately needing money. The Van Dorts mirror this insecurity from the opposite direction. They have money but lack status. They want respectability. The Everglots have status but lack money. Both families therefore enter the marriage with selfish motives. Victoria and Victor are caught inside their parents' negotiations. Then the film introduces the dead community. This community functions almost like a surrogate family for Emily. Characters such as Bonejangles turn death into entertainment. The dead tell stories. They sing. They remember. They tease one another. That communal energy matters because Emily's tragedy is fundamentally about isolation. In life, she was alone when she died. In death, she finds people. The dead ensemble also prevents the movie from becoming unbearably bleak. Every time the story approaches emotional darkness, someone makes a joke. A skeleton loses a limb. Someone sings. Someone complains about being dead. The comedy creates breathing room, but it also reinforces the film's central inversion. The dead have learned to live with death. The living are terrified of social death. The fear of embarrassment. The fear of losing status. The fear of disappointing parents. The fear of being judged. The supporting characters therefore do more than fill scenes. They create a community against which the loneliness of the central characters becomes visible. The movie is ultimately full of lonely people. Victor is lonely inside his family. Victoria is lonely inside her home. Emily is lonely even among the dead. And yet the land of the dead becomes the first place where loneliness can actually be shared. Part 5 Themes Symbolism. Section 5.1 Core Themes. The central theme of Corpse Bride is love versus obligation. The movie begins with marriage, but marriage is almost immediately separated from romance. For the families, marriage is useful. For Victor, it is frightening. For Victoria, it is restrictive. For Emily, it represents a dream. For Burkiss, it is profitable. The same ritual means something different to every character. That is why the question of choice becomes so important. Can a relationship be meaningful if one person has no freedom to choose it? The film repeatedly suggests that the answer is no. Victor's parents may pressure him. Victoria's parents may pressure her. Emily may believe the accidental vows bind Victor to her. But none of those things automatically create love. Love requires willingness. That makes Emily's final decision so powerful. She finally understands that keeping Victor would turn her love into another form of obligation. And she refuses to do that. The film also explores class. Money controls almost every major decision in the living world. The Van Dorts want status. The Everglotts need financial rescue. Burkiss wants wealth. Marriage becomes the mechanism through which these economic problems are supposedly solved. That makes the land of the dead strangely liberating. Once everyone is a skeleton, social status becomes difficult to maintain. Wealth disappears. Clothing becomes less important. The body itself reveals that everyone eventually becomes physically equal. Death strips away the hierarchy that dominated life. Loneliness is another major theme. Victor's loneliness is social. Emily's is emotional. Victoria's is institutional. All three characters are surrounded by people, and yet lack genuine freedom. The movie therefore makes an important distinction between being surrounded and being connected. You can live in a crowded room and still feel completely alone. Death becomes liberation because Emily no longer has to perform the roles society assigned her. That does not mean death is presented as inherently better than life. It means that the movie uses death as a metaphor for the removal of social expectations. The deeper message is that being alive is not the same thing as truly living, and sacrifice becomes the final expression of that idea. Genuine love does not ask, "How do I get what I want?" It asks what allows the person I love to be free. That is why the film feels unusually mature. It does not define love through possession. It defines love through selflessness. Section 5.2 Visual Symbolism. The most recognizable visual device in Corpse Bride is the contrast between the two worlds. The land of the living is dominated by muted tones. The architecture feels narrow. The characters are often framed within restrictive spaces. The overall visual language communicates emotional repression. Nobody is literally chained to the walls, but almost everyone appears trapped. Then the land of the dead explodes into color. The difference is immediate. The dead are colorful because they are expressive. Their movements are larger. Their spaces are more open. Their music is louder. The visual joke becomes a philosophical statement. The living world looks dead because it has no emotional freedom. The dead world looks alive because its inhabitants have nothing left to hide. Emily's blue skin fits perfectly into that symbolism. Blue can communicate sadness, distance, melancholy, and otherworldliness. She is beautiful, but her beauty is inseparable from grief. Her wedding dress is also significant. It is a symbol of the future she lost. She remains visually dressed for a ceremony that never truly happened. Victor's black suit represents another kind of confinement. He is dressed for the role he is expected to perform. Victoria's pale appearance mirrors the controlled environment of the living world. Even her beauty feels restrained. Then there are the skeletons. They are grotesque, but they are also honest. There is nothing left to hide. No wealth can disguise the bones. No social status can change the structure underneath. The body becomes equal. That is why decomposition is not presented simply as horror. It becomes transformation. The butterfly imagery completes the metaphor. A butterfly emerges from a form that has been fundamentally changed. Emily's final transformation therefore represents release. She is no longer the bride waiting for a wedding. She is no longer the corpse waiting for a promise. She becomes movement itself. The forest functions as another symbolic space. It is the threshold between worlds. Victor enters it as one person and emerges connected to another world. Doors, windows, graves, and underground spaces repeatedly reinforce the idea of separation. The characters are always crossing boundaries. Living and dead. Inside and outside. Freedom and obligation. Love and possession. The visual language tells this story before the dialogue does. Section 5.3 Deeper Meanings. The land of the dead can be interpreted as an inversion of Victorian society. In the living world, identity is built around class. In the dead world, everyone has become physically equal. A wealthy aristocrat and a poor worker may have very different histories, but skeletons reveal the same basic structure underneath. Death strips away social performance. That does not mean the dead become identical personalities. They remain individuals, but their social hierarchy loses its power. This makes marriage another important symbol. A wedding is supposed to represent union, but in the living world, marriage is often treated as an institution of control. Who gets married? Who benefits? What does the family gain? What does society expect? The ritual can exist without genuine emotion. Emily's story exposes that difference. She has the ceremony. She has the dress. She has the ring. But she never receives the freedom to choose her own future. Victor and Victoria have the possibility of genuine love, but their families attempt to control the conditions under which that love can exist. Burkiss represents the darkest version of the same system. He wants possession without emotional responsibility. Emily's final decision therefore becomes philosophical. She does not need Victor to validate her. She does not need to win the competition. She does not need to become the bride in a conventional sense. She needs to become free. That is why the butterfly matters. Transformation does not mean becoming someone else. It means escaping the form that has trapped you. The movie also treats mortality with unusual humor. Death is not an ending that must be whispered about. It is a fact. The dead laugh about it. They dance. They tell stories. They remain emotionally complicated. This allows the film to explore mortality without becoming morbid. And that leads to one of its deepest ironies. The world of the living contains many of the film's cruelest behaviors. People lie. People manipulate. People exploit. People sacrifice relationships for status. The dead, meanwhile, often behave with greater compassion. The movie never says that death is better than life. It asks what makes life worth living. And the answer seems to be freedom, connection, honesty, and the ability to choose. Part 6 Production Breakdown. Section 6.1 Animation Visual Effects. Stop-motion animation is easy to underestimate because the final image hides the labor behind it. When you watch Victor move through a room, you do not see an animator physically adjusting a puppet between individual frames. You simply see Victor move. That illusion is the achievement. The characters were built around articulated structures that allowed animators to manipulate their bodies in controlled ways. Their costumes had to remain consistent. Their facial expressions had to communicate subtle emotional shifts. The sets had to survive repeated manipulation. Every movement was planned. Every gesture mattered. And that is especially important for Victor. His nervous personality is communicated physically. His shoulders pull inward. His limbs move awkwardly. His hands hesitate. His body seems to apologize before he speaks. Emily moves differently. She is more theatrical, more graceful, more confident. But because she is dead, her movement can also become exaggerated. The dead ensemble is even more energetic. Their skeletal bodies allow the animators to push physical comedy further. Limbs can detach. Bodies can bend. Characters can move in ways that would be impossible for ordinary human performers. The animation style therefore becomes part of the humor. But it also becomes part of the emotional storytelling. Stop motion has a tactile quality. You can sense that these characters occupy real miniature spaces. The lighting falls across actual surfaces. Clothing has physical texture. The environments have depth. Fog, shadows, doors, graves, furniture, and architecture interact with the characters. The camera can move through miniature sets and create a cinematic scale that makes the world feel much larger than its physical dimensions. Digital effects can enhance those images, but the foundation remains physical. That distinction matters. Contemporary CGI can create almost anything. Stop motion creates something specific. It creates the feeling that the impossible has been physically constructed. And that makes Corpse Bride especially appropriate for its story. These characters are about bodies, death, transformation, physical remains. A computer-generated corpse could have looked polished. A practical puppet corpse feels strangely intimate. The handmade nature of the film mirrors the handmade nature of the world. Even the imperfections become part of the experience. There may be tiny irregularities in movement. A gesture may feel slightly unnatural. character may not move with the perfect fluidity of digital animation, but those imperfections remind us that someone touched every frame, that human labor gives the movie its warmth. Section 6.2 Directorial Vision. The visual language of Corpse Bride is strongly associated with Tim Burton, but the finished film is the result of collaboration. Director Mike Johnson helped shape the stop-motion production into a coherent cinematic experience, while Burton's broader aesthetic influence is visible throughout the design. The combination works because the movie never allows one tone to completely dominate. It is gothic, but not relentlessly frightening. It is romantic, but not sentimental. It is funny, but not emotionally shallow. It is macabre, but not cruel. That balance is extremely difficult. A scene can move from a joke to sadness within seconds. A corpse can be introduced as a visual gag, and then become the center of an emotional confession. A wedding can look beautiful and disturbing at the same time. The direction also uses framing to reinforce the social differences between the worlds. Living world interiors feel cramped. Characters are often surrounded by architectural lines. The environment seems to press inward. The land of the dead opens up. The camera can move through larger spaces. Characters gather together. The frame becomes more energetic. This is not just production design. It is character psychology expressed through geography. Victor's body language changes depending on where he is. In the living world, he is constantly shrinking. In the land of the dead, he gradually becomes more expressive. Emily is almost the opposite. She seems most alive when she is among the dead. The directors also make an important tonal decision by refusing to turn Emily into a villain. That keeps the audience emotionally uncertain. We understand Victor's fear. We understand Emily's hope. We understand Victoria's situation. The story does not force us to hate one character so that another can win. Instead, it makes the final solution depend on understanding. The film's collaboration between animation, art direction, cinematography, voice acting, music, and sound creates one unified language. Nothing feels accidental. The world looks strange because the characters feel strange. The characters move strangely because their emotions are unusual. The music becomes theatrical because the dead world is theatrical. The horror becomes romantic because the film is ultimately interested in empathy. That is the directorial achievement. Part 7 Music Sound. Section 7.1 Musical Score Analysis. Danny Elfman's score is one of the film's emotional engines. Without the music, the story would still function, but it would not feel the same. Elfman's musical language has long been closely associated with Burton's worlds, particularly their mixture of gothic atmosphere, theatrical energy, melancholy, and playful darkness. In Corpse Bride, that combination becomes especially important because the film constantly moves between emotional states. The living world is restrained. Its music tends to reflect formality. The dead world is energetic. Its musical language is more theatrical. That contrast mirrors the visual contrast. Victor's musical identity is nervous. Emily's is emotional and expansive. The score can make a moment feel playful and tragic almost simultaneously. This is particularly important for Emily, because she is a character whose emotional state cannot always be explained through dialogue. She is happy to have Victor. She is terrified of losing him. She is insecure about Victoria. She remembers the betrayal that killed her. Music allows those contradictions to exist at once. The score also helps turn death into celebration. The dead do not walk silently through the afterlife. They perform. They dance. They sing. Music becomes evidence that emotional life continues after physical life ends. And then there are moments when the music becomes quieter. Those moments matter because silence can be more powerful after a world of constant theatrical sound. The score therefore creates emotional rhythm. Comedy, silence, romance, chaos, grief, release. The final sequence benefits enormously from that musical architecture. By the time Emily transforms, the audience has already learned to associate her with melancholy and theatrical beauty. The music allows the transformation to feel like both an ending and a beginning. That is why the soundtrack remains memorable. It does not simply accompany the story. It teaches us how to feel the story.
The songs en korpse brede are not interruptions. Ty are narratieve devices. According to plan immediately tells is hof the adults understand the world. If everyone has a plan. If everyone knows what they want. And almost nobody asks what Victor and Victoria want. The structure of the song turns social performance into entertainment. The characters sing because speaking honestly without it poses the absurdity of their expectations. Ten reminds of that they transforms Emily's history into theatrical storytelling. Bone Youngles bekomes a narrator. The diet community turns tragedy into performance. Dat is significant because Emily's backstory felt halve been delivered trouge ordinary exposition. Instead, de filmmakers maak het memorable. We experience the story emotionally. Tears to set goes even deeper. Emily is surrounded by people but feels insecure. She compares herself. She worries that Victor killed prefer Victoria. Her loneliness becomes visibly trouge misses. The song does not simply tell us that Emily is sad. It lets us experience the sadness. The wedding song does something completely different. It turns the idea of marriage into community celebration. The diet are excited. They participate. They make the wedding feel yours. That creates another contrast with the living wedding. Weer everyone is anxious about status and appearances. Sound desig complete is the illusion. Footsteps. Doors. Chains. Bonus moving. Skeletons dancing. Underground spaces. De soundskape maak is de miniature en vir onmens veel bicycle. The difference between silence and musical choice is especially important. The living world can feel almost too quiet. The dead world can become overwhelming with the sound. That contrast becomes another bridge between the worlds. The audio design essentially gevestigd two societies different emotional voices. The film will lose much of its identity without that distinction. Part 8 Cultural Impact. Section 8.1 Immediate reception. When audiences first encountered corpse bride, the premise itself created curiosity. A dead bride. An haar fausgroom. A goties wedding. A stop-motion musical. Depp. Helena Bonham Carter. Tim Burton. Tere weer a lot of recognizable ingredients. Betai dit not outomatisally garantie emotioneel sitjes. Te film had toe overkome te Sadov of te nigitmare bevore Christmas. Some fevers enter it petting anotter isonisch Burton stop-motion classes. Otters weer draven by te initial romanse. Animation fans weer interested in te craftsmanship. Burton fans wanted te aesthetisch. And younger audiences should simply enjoy te strange skeletons and songs. One of the strongest reactions centered on Emily. Sy kyklei bekame moore tante korpse from te title. Sy bekame te emotioneel kenter. Haar design was memorable. Wit haar sadness was wat made haar endiere. Te audience onderstoot te tragedie beniate te jokes. Te ending streng teen het dat response. Emily's transformation into bittervlies is visually simple bit emotionally powerful bechouse te entire film has taalgit is wat ze has lost. Te audience has sien haar achievement. Haar insecurity. Haar loneliness. Haar hope. En ten haar acceptance. Dat maak is te final reliase veel net. The film also generated the kind of imagery that naturally survives outside the movie itself. Emily's blue fase. Her wedding dress. The skeleton ensemble. The forest. The bittervlies. The goties architecture. Deze images are immediately recognizable. Hij vindt een almostelijke visual symbols voor de film as avole. De movie sterker toone also gave het an initial position among family-oriented animation. It was accessible to younger audiences but contained themes that adults could interpret differently. Dat dual audience helped it avoid becoming disposable children's. Entertainment. It helped be remembered as a childhood movie while still rewarding adult rewatching. Section 8.2 Long-term influence. The long-term cultural life of corpse breede is arguably more interesting than its initial theatrical moment. It did not become a massive franchise with endless sequels. It did not generate a sprawling cinematic universe. Instead, it became a standalone cultural object. Dat my actually bepaart of why it lasted. The film's identity is concentrated. Emily is iconic. The music is recognizable. The visual style is unmistakable. The ending is memorable. Ante God het aesthetic gefes het aan natural plase in Halloween sulture. As online communities schreef, the film found neef audiences drauge van art, cosplay, edits, clips, decisions. And nostalgia. A younger fever killed the stover the movie years after its release and still understand its basis visual appeal immediately. Dat matters because visual identity is one of the strongest forms of cultural longevity. Some films survive because their characters become franchise brands. Others survive because one image becomes impossible to forget. Corpse breede belongs to the second category. Emily has become particularly durable. Sy is simultaneously romantic, tragic, gothic, beautiful. And unsettling. Dat combination geves artists a lot to work with. Her design gaan beïnterpreted as horror. As romance. As melancholy. As fashion. As fantasy. The soundtrack also helps the film survive. Songs gaan bereide stofer het independent lei of te movie. Quotes gaan circulate. Scenes gaan beklip het. Ta finaal butterflies en se kan beremember het even by people wo have not wat jy te entire film in eiers. Te movies emotioneel meaning also changes wat te age. Hunger fevers my fotos on te spooky romanse. Adults my fotos on autonomie. Some fevers identify witte Victor. Otters identify witte Emily. Otters recognide Victoria's situation. Dat flexibiliteit allows the film to continue generating interpretations. It does not require a seal to remain relevant. It simply requires people to return. Part 9. Critical Analysis. Section 9.1 Criticisms. Audience. Professional criticism and audience affection often operate differently. Krities my evaluate narratieve complexiteit, originaliteit, patching, technical craftsmanship, and comparison with the previous works. Audiences my care more about whether a movie make stem feel something. Corpse brede is interesting because it can succeed under both standards while also revealing limitations. Its animation is an obvious strength. The stop-motion craftsmanship is detailed and ambitious. The character designs are distinctive. The music gefeest the film a strong identity. The voice performance